Great. I think we can go ahead and get started. I see more and more people are kind of trickling in, but we can start. We have an hour and 15 minutes together here today. So time is of the essence, and we'd like to get as much, we'd like to keep as much time for presenting the research report and also opening up for questions from the audience. All contributions are welcome. If you would like to speak, please feel free to raise your hand during the Q&A portion. You can unmute yourself then, or at any point during the webinar, please just drop any comments or questions in the chat, and we'll be collecting them and bringing them to the panelists during the Q&A section. So, for those of you that are not aware, Gulf Sustain is a regional initiative by the Institute for Human Rights and Business, and we work very much to advance responsible business across the Gulf region. We're active currently in Oman, the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. And our work looks a little bit different at each of these country levels, depending on what our partners on the ground want, what sort of the national priorities are. So there's a lot of variation in our work. But one central piece of our work entails engaging with the key sort of industries and stakeholder groups that contribute to Gulf states' ongoing economic and social transformation plans. So each of these Gulf states have plans and visions for their future on how to diversify their economies away from sort of reliance on oil and gas revenues. And one common denominator of these plans is the importance of the construction sector. So developing infrastructure, building mega projects, tourism sites, these are some of the key sort of drivers of these future visions for all of these Gulf states. But despite the huge role that the industry plays in the development model, there is quite little attention paid to what construction supply chains look like specifically in the Gulf and where some of these sort of key risks and opportunities lie. So we identified this need through our own work in Gulf Sustain. And over this last year, we've partnered with Design for Freedom by Grace Farms to begin asking some of these questions and looking in more depth at these supply chains, starting with sand, which is one of the most highly demanded and sort of least visible materials in the world. We're very pleased today to finally be with you all to present our research report, which we've been developing behind the scenes for quite a while in collaboration with Design for Freedom and Newcastle University. The report, which is available for download on the Gulf Sustain site, is called Mapping Sand Supply Chains in the Gulf. And later on in this session, we'll be hearing from the research team. And again, we'll have opportunity to ask questions. So we encourage you all to read the report, engage with the report, and please share any sort of feedback or comments as we continue to take this work forward. And we'll build on this report in future engagements as well. Before we dive in, I just want to quickly introduce our guest speakers and contributors here today. We're joined by Dr. Louise Gallagher from the Coalition for Responsible Sand and Silicates. I'm also joined by Emma Gallo, who's from Design for Freedom and Grace Farms and has worked very closely with me throughout this time on developing this research. And of course, the actual research team, Dr. Chris Hackney and Hannah Runnacles from Newcastle University, who will be presenting the findings of this research throughout today. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. We're recording the session here today. We will be sharing the recording on our website after, probably from tomorrow, we'll be sharing the recording. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Louise Gallagher for some framing remarks and introduction of the coalition's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Thanks. Hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Emma. I'm going to pick up on a thread that Tamara laid out so beautifully in the opening, which is all about the visibility of this material, or rather the invisibility. I've been working with this topic for longer than I thought I would be. Started in 2012 working at WWF. It was first on the list for our freshwater folks to want to talk about what was happening with sand extraction in the Mekong, which Chris knows very well. And all the way through since 2012, I've been working with many, many different types of organizations as we build this very first multi-stakeholder action towards responsible sourcing of sand and silicates. The one thing absolutely everybody agrees on, you might come from IKEA, you might come from Gilbane Building Company, you might come from the OECD, but one thing we all come back around to is the invisibility of this material. It is the second most consumed material after water, the most consumed solid material that we use in our economies and in our daily lives. And yet we just don't see it very often. So yeah, all those years, all those different rooms, all those different conversations, I think the focus has to be on how we're going to address that invisibility. Why we need to do that, I think it's very important that people understand the scale at which we're consuming this material, but also the scale of our dependency upon it. 29 major global economic sectors in my mapping for the OECD earlier this year. Show a huge dependency on this material. So that's sectors, everything from tourism, automotive, semiconductors, food and beverage. I'm naming the standard examples here just to show some of the range. But of course, the built environment amongst all the sectors that are consuming is consuming one of the biggest strands of these materials. So we have over 50 billion tons is our figure that we like to talk about that we rely on or we consume every single year. That comes from UNEP, that figure. 40 billion tons of that are estimated to be aggregates flowing into our built environment. Concrete alone accounts for 30 billion. So this is the bound aggregates that we use, 30 billion tons a year. It's such a scale that it's very hard to imagine. I wanted to also add that it doesn't stop just at concrete and structure. It also includes the glass that we consume and the ceramics that we consume in the built environment. So our relationship in that sector of construction in the built environment to this material is rich and very deep, and we're not looking enough. So that's where I think we need to begin the work that we're doing. And that's why I was so excited to see this report on the table and ready to go then when I saw it being published. It's reports like this that start to make the flows visible. We are seeing a tremendous amount of focus on critical minerals, for example, in the responsible mineral supply world. Our materials are much bigger than those materials, and they're also essential to the energy transition and everything else we want to achieve. So this type of report really starts to put a spotlight on the flows. If we can't see it, we can't manage it. If we can't manage it, we don't have a clue what kind of risks we're exposing ourselves and others to. So I'm really grateful for the work. I'm grateful to the Institute, to Chris and to Hannah for the hard work. And of course to Emma. I'm going to hand over to you to explain a little bit more about why this particular region, why this particular work, but I'm really excited to be working with you to make this material visible for everybody in the work of the coalition as we go forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Louise. Thank you for those very generous words. And thank you actually for that word invisibility, because that word is precisely why Design for Freedom exists. So for those of you who are not yet aware of the Design for Freedom movement, I certainly will get to that in just a moment. But for now, I think I'd like to pick up from Louise and how she set out what the coalition and the wider global conversation are calling for. Make the flows visible, follow the material from extraction to final use, and ask the questions that have gone unasked. And this year, that call acquired the weight of an international standard. In February, the OECD published Due Diligence for Responsible Sand and Silicate Supply Chains, the first time the leading global framework for responsible mineral sourcing has been applied to sand. Its asks are strikingly specific. It calls on companies to map where sand originates, the transport route it travels, and where it overlaps with high-risk areas. It calls for risk data to be generated and shared across the sector, and it names the gaps plainly. Whole of supply chain research on sand is rare, and due diligence expectations must now extend to these materials. The report we are sharing today is our answer to that call. Where does this come from? Who handled it along the way? And for our part of this work especially, what happened to the worker? To our knowledge, it is the first dedicated mapping of sand supply chains across the Gulf region. 4 countries followed stage by stage from extraction through processing and transport to construction, with the human rights risks at each stage named and located. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of evidence the OECD has said the sector is missing. Okay, so now back to Design for Freedom, as promised. Design for Freedom is a movement launched in 2020 by Sharon Prince, CEO and founder of Grace Farms Foundation. a cultural and humanitarian center in New Canaan, Connecticut, set on 80 acres of publicly accessible landscape, whose work to end modern slavery includes reimagining how we build. The movement brings industry leaders together to eliminate forced labor in the building material supply chain, create true market transformation, and build a more equitable future. And it comes from inside the industry itself. Our working group of more than 100 leaders is mobilizing the full ecosystem of architectural, engineering, and construction professionals, from designers and owners to construction teams, manufacturers, and suppliers, who looked at their own materials and started asking, where do our buildings come from? We asked that question of our food and our clothing. The built environment was the last great supply chain where no one was asking. And now the people who make it are. Louise, thank you for giving us the volumes, and I'd like to add the human numbers. The ILO estimates nearly 28 million people are trapped in forced labor worldwide, and 160 million children are in child labor. Construction is the #1 industrial sector at risk of forced labor. It represents 13% of global GDP, and 1 in 6 documented forced labor cases is linked to it. And the OECD is clear about why the sector struggles to see its own risks. Supply chains are so fragmented and subcontracted that, as our partners at IHRB have documented, they can run 9 levels deep or more. And as Sharon Prince puts it, their suffering should not be built into our construction. That is the challenge, and it is also the invitation. Design for Freedom exists to build a forced labor-free future, and to do it from within, moving construction from the last sector to ask these questions to the sector that leads. Our role is to equip the industry. The Design for Freedom Toolkit gives design and construction professionals practical means and methods, material transparency, ethical selection, and responsible procurement on any construction, interiors, or landscape project, and in material libraries. At its heart is one simple question put to every material. Where are the raw and composite materials sourced, and by whom? The toolkit is a living resource, and its next iteration will build directly on research like today's report, carrying this evidence into the hands of the people specifying and procuring materials every day. This is how a movement grows: evidence in, better questions out to guide action. Every project that asks makes it easier for the next one to do the same. Our pilot project program, launched in 2022, challenges real project teams to examine their supply chains for fair labor and model more transparent, ethical sourcing in practice. Completed and under construction pilot projects now span a diverse range of typologies across 3 continents, each one yielding new research, new partnerships, and new proof of how to build more humanely. So I'll move quickly into why we knew sand was necessary to sort of really put under the lens. Because through a construction lens, sand is the foundational building material. I mentioned the human numbers. Here is the material one. Thank you. Louise also briefly mentioned this, but the numbers are so staggering. I think I'll just sort of reiterate that concrete now constitutes nearly half of all human-made mass on the planet. And there is no concrete without sand and aggregates. Every foundation poured, every facade glazed, every tile laid begins its life as extracted material. For a movement dedicated to ethical building materials, sand is certainly not adjacent to our work. It is the ground our work stands on. We knew attention here was not optional. It was entirely necessary, and nowhere more so than in the Gulf. Here is a region in the middle of one of the most resource-intensive building programs in history, surrounded by desert, and yet the desert cannot supply it. Wind-blown dune sand is structurally unsuitable for high-strength concrete. The grains are too rounded to bind, so the sand in the Gulf's towers and infrastructure arrives through complex, often opaque supply chains of marine, river, and manufactured sand, crossing borders, passing through many hands. Every one of those hands belongs to a worker. And until now, almost no one has asked who those workers are or what conditions they face. This report asks, and it could only ask because of the partners around this table. My deep thanks to Tamara and the Gulf Sustain team at IHRB, whose regional relationships and human rights expertise anchored this work. To Dr. Hackney and Hannah at Newcastle University, whose research rigor you're about to see for yourselves. And to Louise and the coalition she so generously mentioned, which Grace Farms is proud to be a founder member of. We sincerely believe the light is brighter when we gather around a table with a shared ethos and the same values. Time is not on our side, and solving this together is the only way we end forced and child labor in building material supply chains at pace. Which brings us to the evidence itself. Chris, Hannah, it is my great pleasure to hand over to you to take us through the findings and the recommendations that turn this mapping into practical action. Over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Tamara. And welcome, everyone. Myself and Hannah are thoroughly delighted to be here today to present the findings from this report that we've been working on over the past few months. As way as introduction, I'm Dr. Chris Hackney. I'm a senior lecturer in physical geography at Newcastle University. And my research has been looking at the impacts of sand extraction on the environment and its socio-economic impacts for nearly a decade. Hannah, I don't know if you want to give a quick introduction to yourself.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Chris. Yes, broadly, my PhD research has focused on developing techniques and approaches to examine both the morphological and socio-environmental impacts of sand mining, predominantly in Southeast Asia, but also other contexts. Yeah, I'll pass back over to you, Chris.
Thank you. I don't know if the slides are up. There we go. Great. Thank you. So today, as we've heard, we aren't just talking about a raw material. We're dissecting one of the most complex, opaque, and critical supply chains on the planet. As we heard from Louise, sand and gravel form the literal foundation of our built environment, with global extraction reaching 50 billion tons annually. Yet, because sand is a high volume, often low value bulk commodity, the supply chain has historically been treated as practically invisible. Global data sets suggest that about 1% of that sand that's extracted crosses international borders. So the vast majority of globally consumed sand comes from domestic sources and stays within national boundaries. But that international trade shouldn't be overlooked. It still constitutes a significant amount and volume of sand. The true challenge lies in mapping the sprawling, multi-tiered domestic and regional supply chains of this material. From the point of extraction to the final product, these supply chains are largely unmonitored. And if we're to build sustainable cities and sustainable livelihoods alongside them, we need to ensure that labour and human rights are improved throughout the entire global sand supply chain. That needs urgent assessment, accounting, and responsibility for the human and environmental costs embedded in every grain of sand that we use. Next slide, please. Unlike some critical minerals, for example, lithium or cobalt, which are subject to often intense geopolitical scrutiny and rigorous supply chain audits, sand operates in a relative global governance vacuum. We've heard that the OECD has started to push and drive forward these sort of global governance frameworks for sustainable sand. The sand and aggregates are intrinsically linked to the majority of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but often to competing ends. For instance, the drive to improve infrastructure, to provide housing and schooling that requires concrete and therefore sand and aggregates, is often in direct friction with the need for improved environmental protections to protect life on water and to protect life on land. Because the regulation of sand to date has often been represented by a tapestry of national level frameworks rather than an international agreed framework, we often see a race to the bottom in terms of environmental and labour standards within these. Next slide, please. Where these supply chains lack that transparency, the opportunity for illicit economies thrives. As reported by Ramadan in 2020, the illegal aggregate trade of sand and aggregates is now estimated to be worth up to $350 billion annually. That places it third or fourth in the list of illicit economies. This opacity can lead to severe human exploitation and reductions in human rights for those embedded within supply chains, making them uniquely vulnerable to forced labour, debt bondage, and human trafficking. Accounting for these materials means confronting the reality, as it was put by Emma, that modern slavery can be embedded in the foundations of our often most celebrated infrastructure. Next slide, please. So, to shed light on some of that opacity in the Gulf region, over the past few months at Newcastle University, we've synthesized 4 major international data sets to try and understand what these regional supply chains of aggregates look like. These include UN databases, so UN Contrade and the UNEP SCP HAT tool, the Resource Trade Earth datasets, and the Global Material Flows datasets that explore contemporary trade and labour footprints of construction-based materials over the period from 2015 to 2024. Both the Comtrade and the Resource Trade Earth datasets examine the import and export of construction-based materials. And these are split and aggregated, bad pun, into different codes such as natural sands, quartz, gravel, and document the mass and monetary value of trade between countries on an annual basis. More broadly, the Global Material Flows database aggregates individual materials into construction-dominant proportions of non-metallic materials, as well as international import and exports of materials, and it unpicks the domestic extraction and consumption of those materials within the country. Lastly, the SCP HAT tool is a sector-based data set which examines 4 key construction-related industries: the construction material quarrying, the construction itself, the ceramics, and in addition, the coal, oil, and gas mining that requires a heavy infrastructure footprint as well. This dataset explores the material footprint and, importantly, the workforce behind these industries in terms of number of workers, skill levels, and gender. We synthesize these data together to kind of address the issues that were raised in the introductory remarks about the opacity of these supply chains. It's worth noting here that these datasets are limited into exploring trade, consumption, and extraction at the national level, and so we can't discern subnational facets of these at this time because of data unavailability. Next slide, please. So our report specifically focuses on 4 countries in the Gulf region, namely Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Oman. And although this region is abundant in desert sand, as we've heard, the region's urban expansion relies almost entirely on marine dredged, fluvial, or crushed rock sources due to the unsuitability of that desert sand for its use in construction. That geological limitation fundamentally shapes the regional supply chain. Today, we'll give an overview of these trade dynamics, workforce composition across our 4 focus countries, and highlight areas where possible risks to human rights and forced labour might be prevalent. Our full report that's available on the website, and I think the link has been posted in the chat, goes into more detail on the application of digital technologies and traceability tools that form the basis of some of our recommendations. But today we won't go over these for the sake of time, but if that is of interest, please refer to the full report for details on those aspects. Okay, next slide, please. The data on this side shows national level trends over the past 50 or so years in imports and exports of non-metallic mineral construction. The take home from this dataset reported here reveals 4 highly distinct supply chain archetypes that we see across this region. Saudi Arabia operates as a domestically dominated supply chain, consuming up to 600 million tons of sand every year, the vast majority of which is extracted from within its own borders. The United Arab Emirates seems to function as a regional transit and processing hub, re-exporting nearly 45% of its non-mineral extraction. Oman is a net producer of sand and aggregates, exporting its domestic extraction across the region, whilst Qatar remains structurally dependent on imports, forcing it to manage incredibly complex long-distance supply chains. So within our 4 focus countries, we have very different setups in terms of the demand and sources of sand and aggregates. Understanding these archetypes is crucial because it means a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work. And therefore, the supply chain risks in, say, Oman's domestic quarries are fundamentally different from the large-scale supply chains that Qatar might be exploiting. Next slide, please. The graph on this slide shows the breakdown of different components of the sand and aggregate supply chain, going from bulk sand and aggregate to sort of quartz and silica sand. And while bulk construction sand dominates the physical landscape of the sand supply chains in the region, we see a more subtle high-value supply chain of silica sand starting to emerge in the Gulf region over the past decade or so. The UAE now accounts for up to 15% of global quartz and silica sand imports. Silica sand itself is not solely used in concrete, but has recently seen rising demand due to the global boom in digital and green transitions, and is fundamental to solar panels, advanced manufacturing, high-end electronics, and growth in data centers. This is a highly specialized supply chain that requires much higher purity sand, meaning it may often be sourced from further afield. That in itself introduces entirely new transnational human rights and environmental footprints into this region's material. I'm now going to pass over to Hannah, who's going to go through the country profiles of each of our 4 study sites and talk a bit of detail about what is happening within each country.
Thank you, Chris. If we could just move, yeah, perfect, thank you. So now Chris has given us that regional overview of the countries. We're now going to break these supply chains down by country to understand exactly where the human environmental pressure points lie. So for each country, we will outline the kind of major trade flows before we look at the demand drivers, employment breakdowns in the different supply chains within both the construction, the quarrying, the ceramics, and the coal, oil, and gas mining industries. Next slide, please. So firstly, if we look at the UAE, supply chain here is highly dynamic. The country consistently pulls raw materials from Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, but exports processed aggregates predominantly out to Bahrain, but also to Kuwait, to Bangladesh, Iraq, and Qatar, among others. The global spread of this export market indicates long international supply chains that may operate in different regulatory frameworks between the countries, and therefore possible blind spots therein. These kind of supply chains makes continuous human rights due diligence more difficult in such contexts. Next slide, please. So now if we have a look at the demand drivers across the UAE, domestically, the construction and rapidly expanding ceramic sectors in the UAE drives the national material footprint of the country. And here, this just refers to the total amount of a raw material that's extracted, driven by the final consumption for a particular product of a given country. So here, our workforce analysis reveals that the demographic is very heavily skewed towards the quarrying sector for construction, where in 2024, this employed over 130,000 people alone. Of this workforce, over 54% of the workforce is classified as low-skilled migrant labour. So this substantial growth reflects a kind of decade-long demand cycle fueled by big infrastructure projects and the legacy of Expo 2020. Next slide, please. Now turning to kind of more specific employment and labour in the UAE. This slide highlights a kind of key aspect of the supply chain in the UAE, the supply chain workforce behind it. So whilst construction in the UAE employs 6% of the total workforce here, the actual total supply chain labour footprint, which means the total human work required for the sector, is actually 16.5%. Meaning for every worker on site, 3 more are required upstream in processes like rock crushing, driving heavy goods vehicles, or operating dredgers. More traditional ESG reporting lacks to account for this kind of 1 to 3 multiplier. So companies may be kind of unaware of this human footprint associated with their projects. Next slide, please. Now turning to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This supply chain is defined by unprecedented consumption of construction materials, unlike the other countries we've looked at. It's driven by the Vision 2030 strategy. Domestic extraction by the quarrying sector alone has surged by over 350% from 1990 to 2024, peaking to over 550 million tonnes annually. Our report here emphasises the enormous domestic logistical strain this creates, associated with moving 500 million tonnes of aggregate across the country, requiring heavily carbon-intensive, localised trucking networks. So here, the supply chain bottleneck is not only the availability of the material, but the physical capacity and occupational safety of the transport networks that move this material around. Next slide, please. So looking at the supplier networks, despite the large domestic supplies, this Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is reliant on a vast global network of material. This is predominantly from China, from the UAE, Spain, amongst other countries, to match domestic consumption needs. And here our report highlights that as Saudi Arabia attempts to develop multiple giga projects concurrently, supply chain bottlenecks are inevitable here. The speed and the magnitude of the growth may pressurize more vigorous vetting of suppliers as it favors kind of the speed and volume of outputs. Which raises the risk of inadvertently sourcing from potentially environmentally degraded or labour exploitative operations. Next slide, please. So here in Saudi Arabia, the construction industry alone claims over 50% of the country's workforce and the material footprint. The rapid establishment of mega quarries feed things like NEOM or the Red Sea project. And these kind of projects and impacts irreversibly alter pristine landscapes in the desert and the coast. So here, assessing this supply chain requires environmental accounting that measures biodiversity loss long before the construction stage begins. And kind of similar to the UAE, this rapid increase in quartz and silica sands that Chris pointed out may indicate more kind of digital upscaling associated with digital infrastructure and data center growth. Next slide, please. Looking at the employment and labor of these industries, in Saudi Arabia, the construction sector alone employs over 1 million people directly, with a massive upstream labor footprint of over 17%. But as we outline in the report, the actual domestic quarrying sector that supplies the construction industry is very automated. So in 2024, it employed only 40,000 workers to move 550 million tons of material. So the risk here in the supply chain isn't necessarily the hand quarrying, which is more automated. It's the occupational health hazards and specifically kind of silica, airborne dust, and extreme heat in the construction industry, faced by the big network of truck drivers and crushing plant operators to feed giga projects in Saudi Arabia. Next slide, please. Moving to Qatar, unlike any of the countries we've examined here, Qatar represents the most outsourced supply chain. It imports over 50% of its construction material. This is essentially offshores kind of environmental and social impacts of its infrastructure to neighbouring countries in terms of material sourcing. And this is predominantly Oman and the UAE. So therefore, Qatar's ability to build is beholden on the port infrastructure, on shipping lanes, and the export regulations of other countries. And so supply chain assessments here need to cross kind of multiple sovereign borders. Next slide, please. Turning to the demand drivers in Qatar, the material intensity here is staggering, with a material footprint of 55.2 tons per person per year. This is over 1,400% higher than the MENA average. So whilst this was driven by the 2022 FIFA World Cup, there are questions about what will happen to this supply chain over the next few years, and will other kind of major infrastructure projects continue to drive this demand. So we're now seeing kind of a big deceleration of this massive logistics network, and this can lead to stranded assets in source countries and leave upstream migrant workers more vulnerable. Next slide, please. Looking at the employment and labour of Qatar, it's got the largest employment and labour footprint difference in the region with a 1-to-4 ratio, where direct employment is 6.1%, but the total labour footprint is 26%. Because Qatar imports so heavily and is reliant on imports, the vast majority of the supply chain workforce is actually in other countries. So here it's really important that audits of supply chains include the working conditions of countries that supply them to capture the risks to both environment and people. Next slide, please. And lastly, looking at Oman, Oman has also seen a rapid growth in extraction, increasing by over 1,000% since 1990. Today, it exports over 25 million tons of sand of all kinds a year. From 2017 to 2020 and 2021 to 2024, which are the two timeframes we looked at, the same top 5 suppliers in both periods for Oman were the UAE, Iraq, Iran, and India. However, the supply chain here is very responsive. So between 2014 and 2023, China was the highest supplier, but trade volumes since then have decreased dramatically since 2023, which shows its kind of market responsivity. Next slide, please. So whilst Oman has enormous exports to other countries, it's still reliant on large imports of material. This is mostly from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but also many other countries, which really highlights how integrated and interdependent the regional supply network is here. Next slide, please. So finally, looking at the demand drivers in Oman, demographically, Oman is quite unique. So its broader construction sector is reliant heavily on expatriate workers. For example, the domestic quarrying sector is made up of 70% Omani nationals. This creates a highly stratified supply chain. So whilst the extraction phase is more localized with a national workforce, once material moves to processing and transport, it transitions to a more vulnerable, low-skilled expatriate workforce. So here, supply chain assessments must adapt to these shifting demographic vulnerabilities across tiers in the construction industry. So now we've examined all 4 countries individually in terms of their supply chains, their sectors, and their labour force within the construction industries. We can begin to unpick the human rights risks across the supply chains more broadly. So I'll pass back over to Chris now. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. So the sheer scale and observed growth that we've seen in the region's demand for sands and aggregates has frequently outpaced regulatory oversight. That creates a complex ecosystem where rapid economic growth intersects with significant human rights and occupational safety vulnerabilities. To help ensure the integrity of these supply chains, we can break the supply chains down into the 4 stages that are shown on this diagram. At its most upstream extent is stage 1, that's extraction. Here, the most severe human rights stage include forced labour of adults and children, unsafe working conditions, and land dispossession. Child labour and underemployment are common in many informal quarry sites, and that's highlighted in the recent OECD report as well. These risks are likely to be particularly acute in jurisdictions where the sector's rapid growth has significantly outpaced any regulatory oversight or regulatory forms to keep pace with that growth. Moving downstream of the supply chain, we enter the processing stage, stage 2. This is often characterized by the refinement of raw aggregates, sorting, washing, and processing. The primary risks here are predominantly health hazards, including heat exposure and silicosis or dust inhalation, and general physical hazard workplace accidents. These hazards are profoundly amplified by the extreme climate that exists in the Gulf region and is likely to get more extreme over the coming 50 to 100 years, where rising temperatures pose life-threatening risks to workers in industrial processing facilities. Once the aggregates have been processed, they're then transported. So this is our 3rd stage in the supply chain, and this is the critical link between those processing hubs and the end-use zones of the sand supply chain, often urban construction zones. The key human rights risks at this stage are often migrant exploitation, physical injury, operational dangers, and excessively long working hours. The transport of bulk commodities like sand is uniquely vulnerable to these risks because it relies on a vast network of trucks, drivers, and logistics personnel who have traditionally operated in the region under systems such as the kafala system and similar structures that can limit their labour mobility. Finally, at the sink zones in the construction sites themselves, the defining feature of this stage is the disparity between direct employment and the broader labour footprint, which we've heard from Hannah in the previous slides. This describes the total number of workers across the entire supply chain required to support the construction industries. This is a major oversight gap, which allows significant human rights vulnerabilities to emerge. Low-skilled migrant workers who dominate construction labour forces across all of the 4 countries are often the furthest removed from those compliance policies that end clients are beholden to. Next slide, please. So to help bring these supply chains out from the shadows and the opacity that has kind of shielded them previously, our report provides a set of 6 recommendations to help improve and shed light on the potential issues highlighted in the supply chains across the Gulf region. Next slide, please. The first of these is the recommendation that GCC governments should require disclosure of extraction, processing, and export activities at the site level, particularly in high-volume hubs such as Oman, the UAE, where re-exporting obscures the origin of primary material, potentially masking labour and human rights infringements. Public registries of licensed operators and production volumes would enable more effective oversight and compliance. Companies should map supply chains beyond their first-tier suppliers, identifying subcontractors in transport and processing where risks are concentrated. Applying risk-based due diligence aligned with the OECD report will allow targeted interventions. Greater subnational transparency is essential to reducing illicit extraction, improve traceability, and strengthen the accountability across the complex regional trade flows. Next slide, please. Secondly, we recommend that governments should integrate production, trade, and labour datasets to better reflect workforce imbalances, such as high material consumption alongside relatively low direct employment in extraction, but large supply chain labour footprints. Reporting should include workforce composition, wage compliance, and occupational safety indicators across all stages of the aggregate supply chain. Companies should standardise ESG disclosures and align them with International Labour Organization conventions to ensure consistency, and improved data transparency will enable policymakers and investors to identify where high volume flows coincide with elevated risks of forced labour, supporting more targeted and evidence-based interventions. Next slide, please. Our fourth recommendation is that governments and companies should look to diversify their supply chains to reduce over-reliance on concentrated regional flows. We've seen that Qatar depends on imports for over 50% of its supply, largely from regional partners, while Oman and the UAE dominate exports, and Saudi Arabia remains domestically focused, but increasingly import diverse. Importing countries should broaden sourcing beyond their current suppliers to include international partners with stronger labour and environmental governance. At the same time, GCC governments should engage bilaterally with key source countries for sand to support improved and more responsible sand governance. This can be achieved by collaborating with and adhering to established guidance from the OECD. In parallel, governments and companies should scale investments in recycled aggregates and manufactured sand to reduce pressure on high-intensity extraction hubs. Support from international organisations and institutions can help facilitate this transition. Diversification enhances resilience, reduces systematic risk concentration, and creates market incentives for higher standards. Next slide, please. Here we recommend that GCC governments should engage closely with the GCC Secretariat and other key international organisations such as the OECD, the UNEP, the ILO, and the Coalition for Responsible Sand and Silicates. Establish regional dialogue on just and sustainable sand supply chains. This dialogue should bring together not only GCC governments, but also source country partners, construction companies, and civil society to develop a shared governance framework and standards that ensure responsible sand and aggregate supply chains across the GCC region and its trading partners. The OECD due diligence report for sand and silicate supply chains offers a first entry point for these discussions and fora to coalesce around. Next slide, please. To help all this, we recommend that governments should mandate the use of digital traceability tools, such as digital passports, sedimentary fingerprinting, GPS tracking of transport and logistical components of the supply chain, and electronic permitting across key trade corridors linking major exporters and importers in the region. Companies themselves should integrate these tools into procurement systems to monitor supplier compliance and identify high-risk flows associated with labour exploitation. Advances in satellite monitoring and rapidly developing AI tools can complement these systems by verifying extraction activity in high output areas. Alignment with emerging global frameworks on labour standards, environmental protection, and material sourcing will support the interpretability of this data. A layered digital approach is essential to ensure visibility in bulk commodity supply chains and strengthen due diligence. Next slide, please. And our final recommendation is that GCC government should accelerate the shift towards enforceable contract-based labour standards and systems that guarantee wages, worker mobility, and access to grievance mechanisms. This is critical given the large supply chain footprints identified across the region, where risks are concentrated amongst low-skilled migrant workers in subcontracted roles. In line with the OECD guidance, GCC labour regulators should introduce and enforce mandatory dust suppression, ventilation, and health monitoring requirements for workers engaged across sand supply chains. Such standards should be explicitly included in inspection protocols of national labour authorities. Recruitment fees must be eliminated through stricter regulation and international cooperation. Companies should implement ethical recruitment policies and ensure direct, transparent wage payments across all tiers. An alignment with the International Labour Organization standards is essential here. Strengthening formal labour systems will reduce exploitation and address structural drivers of forced labour. Next slide, please. So, to try and conclude all that, in this report, we highlight that the scale of sand and silicate extraction creates a unique risk landscape, where even a small percentage of international trade can mark significant potential adverse impact. In the context of the GCC and the Gulf region, there is a high level of exposure to supply chain risks, including forced labour, poor worker welfare conditions, especially in the upstream components of the supply chain, that is the quarries, construction plants, and transport networks. For the Gulf to deliver on its extraordinary vision for the future, alignment with the OECD recommendations on sustainable and just sand supply chains is essential and highly important. Thank you, and I'll now hand back to Tamara.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you to all the panelists, especially to Dr. Chris and Hannah for walking us through the research findings and the recommendations. It's a big piece of work. This is really just the first step for us, and we'll continue to build on this work and disseminate some of these findings through public channels, but also privately through our own engagements with government, with businesses, to try and kind of shed light on this as much as possible. I think for us, some of the sort of key takeaways were that we were aware that of the depth of these supply chains. I think we were a little bit more surprised. Well, at least I was a little bit more surprised about the breadth of it in terms of how much sand was being traded amongst GCC countries, its sort of use cases. We've talked a lot today about the construction sector. That's a key one in the Gulf and globally, but also its the impact of sand on other key sectors like hospitality and tourism, like AI and technology, like energy. This was more of a surprise to me. So we'll be using this as a way to engage with all of these sectors with whom we have existing relationships and dialogue. We'd like to now open up to any questions. Please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions, or you can drop anything in the chat as well. I think while some of the questions are coming through, I would just like to ask as well, or flag that when we initially started this report, this was pre-conflict. And we've had some discussions since on what sort of impact the conflict might have on this in terms of, for example, relations with Iran, but also disruptions to shipping routes. So I wonder, Hannah, Dr. Chris, if you can shed a little bit of light on some of the work you did around this aspect specifically.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't find my mouse there to unmute myself. Yes, you're right. The conflict in the region sort of kicked off maybe halfway through when we were starting this, and certainly raised questions about regional specifics, I guess, issues that might be specific to these countries. One of the key things that we found and we saw in the slides Hannah was presenting was the countries such as Iran and other countries involved in the conflict do rely heavily on trade to and from the 4 countries that we focused on here. Regardless of the outcome of the conflict, there will be a need to rebuild infrastructure, to rebuild roads, houses, not just in Iran, but in all the regional places that have been impacted. That is going to demand aggregates and sand to form the foundations of that rebuilding. The interrelationship in the existing supply chains are obviously not immune to geopolitical issues that may arise from the regional conflict. And so there are questions, and we don't know the answer to this, about how those supply chains will react when that demand for rebuilding starts to kick in. Will Iran be looking for alternative suppliers, and what the knock-on effects of that will be for the countries we've looked at specifically here that may have been supplying Iran previously, and now because of geopolitical issues may be looking elsewhere. So there are knock-on effects. It is still in a holding pattern. Who knows what's going to result from this? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really clear. I see we have a hand up. Emma Crates, I will grant you access to speak. There we go. Emma, I'm not sure if you're speaking, but we can't hear you at the moment.
Just, can you
There we
hear me?
go. Yes, we can.
Great. Just to say, thanks for a great presentation. Really, really interesting to hear about what's going on in that region. Apologies if I missed these figures because I joined slightly late. But do you have any statistics on sand that's being exported to European countries? And if so, what kind of sectors?
Sure, Hannah, I don't know if you've got specifically that data to.
So I think the focus of the report was on the countries that were trading the highest volumes in terms of mass of material. These were dominated by more local countries. So we saw countries like India, other Gulf countries like that dominate the trade. Off the top of my head, I don't think European countries kind of dominated that trade, but so they certainly do trade and exchange sand within the 4 countries we've looked at. They just weren't dominating the import and export in terms of mass, if that makes sense. Chris, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that.
Yeah, so we saw with respect to Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia does import from Spain, Italy, and Greece. Those 3 European countries come out in the top 5 imports. In terms of exports, the data will be there within the data sets that we've looked at, but as Hannah said, we predominantly looked at the top 5 to 10 countries for the purposes of brevity, I guess, in this report. But I would imagine that there would be exports to those countries. They would be of a lower volumetric or monetary value to Europe. And in terms of the sectors, they will likely be the bulk aggregates rather than the kind of purer silica and sand, because the demand for those is quite high, is high at the moment everywhere.
Thank you. We have another hand up. Matthew, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Just a quick one, by the way, the chat thing seems to be disabled. So if you're not getting very many chat questions, that might be why. Thank you very much. My name's Matthew Wenban Smith. I'm the standards lead at Responsible Glass. I was just wondering whether you'd considered the potential of responsible sourcing of glass for construction projects. I mean, also potentially solar, automotive, and the rest of glass in the Gulf region as a driver for responsible extraction of silica sand for glass making. And good to see you, Louise, by the way.
Me too. I'm working for Matthew at the moment on exactly this question. So, Chris, I'm very excited to hear what you're going to say.
Yes, breaking the data sets that we have down into individual kind of components of that sector is incredibly difficult given the way that these materials are reported in these current data sets. So you're completely right. We're fully aware that glass is a huge component of the construction industry, not just in building, but as you say, in solar panels and in that kind of drive for green energy and the transition. The way that the data sets that we have used are broken down, bulks them solely into silica and quartz sands. The employment data has sector-based analysis broken down into kind of ceramics, and I don't think, Hannah, you can correct me on here, that glass was one of those. No. So again, breaking down into that fine scale is one of the big issues, I think, at the moment with this traceability of where this material is going. We're getting better, and the data sets are there when bulking everything up together into these big, what are called HS codes, these harmonized systematic codes. But to really understand and pick apart the intricacies of the supply chain at that domestic level, that more nuanced understanding of the sand distribution and where it's going into those different industries is probably the biggest inhibitor at the moment. I don't know, Louise, if you want to add on that. I know you've been working on glass for...
Well, I'm going to make a pitch for the webinar that Matthew and with Responsible Glass and the Coalition for Responsible Sand and Silicas will be doing in September. Matthew, you can throw in the date there, but it's this type of question that I'm dealing with actually today is when these materials are transformed, when they're blended or transformed, it's really hard to do the traceability work from that point back, right? So how much glass is being exported to, or imported, and that is got a silica sand component. It is the highest volume component of glass, but we don't track that very well within the HS coding system. So a lot of what we're doing with data that we do track for trade just doesn't give us the full story here at all, which is why it's really important to have this type of work. And well done again. It was really excellent report, excellent presentation. And why we need to still have the conversations, there's no doubt. I was going to ask you a little bit, if I can jump in tomorrow, about this link between responsibility and reliability. So I worked with the OECD, and thank you for mentioning that report too on making that happen. And that was our mantra throughout it: responsible is reliable. Do you have any comment or any thoughts about that, Chris and Hannah, of course?
Yeah, I mean, from my part, they're two sides of the same coin, right? So responsibility is, or can be, and depends how you're defining it, responsibility for what or for whom. And that's, I know that's a big kind of, I suppose, academic debate going on about when we're talking about responsibility. Is that environmental responsibility? Is that social responsibility? Is that corporate responsibility? There's so many different aspects to that, and I don't think yourself or the OECD would argue that it's one or the other. It's a rounded responsibility. Reliance, again, you know from the decades of kind of engaging with this, Louise, that reliability of reporting and reliability of data sets and reliability of levels of transparency, those reliability levels vary country to country, administration to administration, year to year. There's and that is one of the biggest hindrances, I guess, in our understanding of all of these issues. Some countries are much better and more reliable and repeatable in how they report things than others. So I can, yes, completely agree on both of those things. I don't think you can have one without the other. The reliability might be more easily sorted than the responsibility. That could be presumably mandated from up high, whereas responsibility, because it's so multifaceted, I would imagine would be one where different stakeholders and interest groups might have very different interpretations of that.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions as well coming in through the Q&A function. One of them, an anonymous question asking whether there are plans to sensitize the findings further in the Gulf with different stakeholder groups. Yes, there are plans to do so. So this was a first, a sort of first part of this work, essentially, is developing this report, sharing the findings through the webinar. We'll continue to disseminate this work further through our own engagements, through Gulf Sustain, through our partners as well. But yes, there are very much plans to take this to the 4 Gulf countries that we've assessed in this report, and to directly engage with both businesses and governments where possible on this work, to really kind of bring attention to this, to the material in general across the Gulf. In a related question by Sheila asking if we'd come across more linkages in the sand supply chains in the Gulf and how they maybe overlap with things such as occupational and safety concerns for those who cut quartz countertops in the US. We haven't actually looked into that. As I said, it's in a first instance, we were looking very much in depth at the sort of supply chain specific to the Gulf. It would be very interesting to look at these sort of overlaps in future pieces of work, if possible. That's definitely something we can note for future work. But as of now, we have not looked into this. There is also another question from Vicky around a more general question of sort of what kind of companies trade sand, and do they tend to trade other commodities?
Yeah, and that is a very good question. I think, and again, this comes back to maybe discussions we had slightly earlier around what the type of sand that is being traded and what it is being turned into. Inside, what is its final product? If we're talking bulk aggregates for construction or infrastructure, then typically there will be national level construction supply, material supply companies that will kind of organize and run those supply chains. Higher quality sands and silicates might have companies that are predominantly extracting or transporting those, but then they might get turned into solar panels, glass, ceramics, silica chips, in a more involved supply chain, multifaceted supply chain, of which the companies will then be swapping or trading sand and aggregates between themselves, converting it into different products. So it can be a very complex supply chain at those kind of higher end levels. Typically at the bulk aggregates, it'll be those construction companies that do the majority of the work. Within the 4 countries that we looked at, we don't have the information on which companies are involved in that, because we're looking at the international trade kind of disaggregated data that is, I suppose, anonymized to that level of degree. So not specifically the Gulf, but yeah, it would depend. I mean, sand, as we've heard from Louise, is used in hundreds of different products. Each of those products will have companies that are involved in those supply chains.
And can I add to that, like sand is a catch-all term that we use in a very loose way. And I always ask forgiveness from real materials experts when we do this. We use it for communications purposes. But Chris, you can say something about the variety of grades, of particle size, the mineralogy. Like there's a lot of different variety here within that sand and silicates bucket.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective as a physical geographer, sand is a grain size. It's not a material. It's a size of particle. The geology of that particle can
Exactly.
be myriad.
exactly.
I know there are different uses of sand as a term, but yeah.
Hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. In the interest of time, we'll move to some closing remarks. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. Please feel free to reach out to us. This is just the beginning of the conversation. We're very happy to continue the dialogue. Just before we close, I did want to pass to my fellow panelists in case there are any sort of key takeaways or closing remarks you'd like to share with the audience before. None. Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you to everybody for joining, for your interesting questions, for your high levels of engagement. Special thanks to my fellow panelists for their time, for their contributions, especially Dr. Chris, Hannah. Thank you for taking the time to really walk us through all the hard work that you've put into this over the last few months. It's been a pleasure working with you both. I think we started this webinar with each of the panelists sort of citing the visibility, or rather the sort of invisibility of sand. And that's really been a central driver of this work. Both the report and the webinar here today, the main aim of this has been to start chipping away at some of this invisibility and really bringing this to the fore. And as I've mentioned a few times, the work really doesn't stop here. We have an open invitation to you, to the audience, to reach out to us at any point, to continue having these conversations in group settings or privately in bilateral settings as well. We'll be taking this work to the Gulf, to other forums, to other platforms, wherever possible, to really bring more and more attention to the work. Now that we've come armed with some of this data and some of this evidence specific to the Gulf, it gives us a really good starting point for more of the advocacy and bringing some of these recommendations to light. So we look forward to keeping you all informed on how this work progresses, hopefully expanding it perhaps to other regions, perhaps to other materials, depending on demand. But again, we welcome any sort of feedback or comments from all panelists, from all audience members, businesses, governments, to really make this a sort of joint effort as much as possible. Thank you all so much for your time here today. It was great seeing so many of you, so many familiar faces, well, familiar names, and some new ones too. And we look forward to engaging with all of you soon.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.